We have a very special guest today. He wrote the book on public transit, and he will be talking about the book on public transit. We're joined by Jarrett Walker. Um, Jarrett Walker is an international consultant in public transit. He's been with his firm, Jarrett Walker and Associates, since 1991 and working in the field before that. Done major redesigns of bus networks across the world, from Houston, which was a huge success right before the pandemic in an era where there was a decline almost everywhere else in the country, to Dublin, Ireland, to Australia and New Zealand. He has just published his revised edition with a lot of new material that he's going to talk about on new technology, on new politics of transit. He is a graduate, Juan told me to emphasize this, of Pomona College and Stanford. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jarrett, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards.
Supposed to click here. Thanks. Some notes on the new edition. Okay. Thanks very much. I really appreciate you coming out, and I really appreciate the interest in the new edition of the book. Since I wrote the first edition of the book in 2011, it came out at the end of 2011, and that really set me going on the path of trying to create a consulting practice that was about fostering clear conversation about public transit, leading to confident decisions. And that's sort of the heart of what we're about. We're consultants who ideally would never make a recommendation. What we really like to be doing is being in with the community, being in with a transit agency or a city government, and helping them figure out what they want to do in the context of their own situation. So the most important sentence in the book is, which was in the first edition, is my job in this book is not to make you share my values, but to give you the tools to clarify and advocate yours. So I want people to be able to bring their own values, their own priorities to public transit issues, and figure out how what they want to do is actually can be achieved through public transit planning. So the main topics of the book, I guess, are to give, I mean, the big picture of the book is that I want people to have, want people who are coming to public transit issues to have some sort of tool that they can use to think through the basics and figure out what their opinion should be and what the consequences of their opinion would be. That means defining public transit's role, understanding its geometry, and that's what a lot of the book is about, seeing the real choices we have to think about, and then talking about consequences for land use and location choice. New material this time around includes a whole lot of new pushback on technology hype. So technology hype has been an enormous thing that's changed since 2011 when I wrote the first edition. A great deal of a number of useful inventions have appeared, and a whole lot of nonsense has also been promoted. And so I've put a lot of energy into sorting through that. There's a new chapter on planning for diversity, which comes from, inspired by an instructive outburst from Elon Musk about how terrible public transit is. And that chapter is called A Bunch of Random Strangers. And it refers to Elon Musk's complaint that what's wrong with public transit is that it's full of a bunch of random strangers. And so we talk about why a bunch of random strangers is just foundational to what public transit is and to why it succeeds. Challenging elite projection, which I'll talk about again, and challenging the choice rider fallacy, which I'll talk about a little bit more. There's an expanded discussion of location choice, which I'll talk about a little bit too, because where things are has such an overwhelming impact on whether transit can succeed and how transit can succeed. But finally, and most importantly, since I wrote the first edition of the book, I've figured out much more clearly how to explain the core thing that I'm trying to do when I'm doing network design, and that I want people to focus on in appreciating and evaluating a network design. And that is how we talk about freedom and so there's a new focus on freedom in the book, a new focus on what I call access to opportunity. And so let's talk about that for a second. The wall around your life. You probably are all familiar with the concept of the isochrone, but I want to sort of take that concept and see where we can go with it to tell a story that actually can get people excited about good transit planning. So what's access? Here's a person, she's in a city full of possible destinations, places she could work, places she could shop, places she could study, and in an amount of time she is likely to have in her day. Let's say maybe it's 45 minutes, but there is an amount of time that fits into her day. She can get to a particular area on the transit system as it is. So her access to opportunity is simply the number of useful destinations in that area. We can count access to jobs, we can count access to schools, we can count access to shopping. The computational intensity of this, by the way, is such that it's only really been possible to do this kind of analysis in real time for about the last 10 or 15 years, which is part of why you haven't heard about it as much. A calculation like this is inside a lot of models that are used to predict ridership, they're used to predict behavior. But this is the first step inside those models. The second step is a bunch of social science to figure out, how people supposedly behave in response to their options. But I want to call attention to and isolate this first step where we just talk about what people could do, what the extent of their freedom is, how far out the wall around their life is, for a couple of reasons, one of which is I'm a whole lot more sure about this than I am about the social sciences. I'm a whole lot more sure about my description of your freedom than I am about a model's assumption about how you're going to behave in response to it. So that's one reason. We'll come back to another. So what does this look like in practice? So this is from our Dublin network redesign in 2019. You have a person in a hypothetical location. She could be anywhere. She's asking, where can I go in 45 minutes? The answer, we have a network that is, we have an old network, which is very complicated and has lots of twists and turns, and much of which is not very frequent. The red lines on this map denote frequency. We have a proposed network, which is simpler and more frequent, but that changes bus routes in various ways that will make a lot of people mad. So you need an argument for why you're doing this. So we can then show for any particular location where she could get to now in 45 minutes, where she can get to in the proposed network, what the difference is. And that gives us a talking point like Jane can get to 25% more jobs. Jane has 25% more opportunities in her life in the area that she could get to in an amount of time she's likely to have. We can then just calculate that citywide. So this is the number for that particular point in Dundrum, but we just map it according to what that is like then on every individual, for every individual cell, whether the access to jobs has gotten better or worse. And that gives us a citywide talking point. The average Dubliner can get to 16% more destinations in 45 minutes. The average Dubliner who's going to rely on public transit is, I would like to say, 16% more free. If by freedom, we really understand the presence of options in your life, the presence in your life of multiple different things that you could choose to do, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about your freedom to do anything that requires leaving home. So why does this matter? Well, first of all, access describes the functionality of a city. An economist, of course, would say that a city is a labor market. That's a little bit too simplistic, but a city is definitely a place that people come to achieve, to seek out opportunities that arise from the presence of other people. And that's what we do in cities. That's what we do in, that's what cities are for. So we're really measuring the functionality of the city when we talk about this. We're measuring the degree to which the city, through its transit system, is actually connecting people to opportunity. Secondly, it turns out that just measuring access tells us a lot about ridership, a lot more than you might think. So I grew up thinking that ridership was a mysterious thing that you had to run a complicated demand model to estimate. It turns out that access is really good at isolating the way the network design affects ridership, as distinct from all kinds of other things like pandemic pandemics that affect ridership. So it's isolating the way the actual design of the service is affecting ridership. So while I will never, as a consultant, make a ridership prediction, because ridership isn't predictable, I can talk with great confidence about that ridership potential has been increased if we increase the access that the network provides. And then finally, just personal freedom, right? That's what we're talking about. I'll tell you a funny story that happened in the Houston network plan. Once when I was, we had the plan before the board and I was briefing the board in a public meeting, and one of the board members leaned forward and said, "Come on now, you're a professional. You must have some idea if we implement, what will the ridership change be?" And I had already tried giving them my speech about how ridership is not really predictable. But, you know, he wanted me like, you know, to be the sort of expert who displays his, you know, valor as an expert by making a falsifiable prediction. And so I said, well, after 2 years, you can expect about a 20% increase net of all other changes, I said. And he was satisfied. And he was satisfied, and that answered his question. And and that helped him vote yes. And yet, of course, I had just said nothing. Because when I said net of all other changes, of course, that is the out, because because in 2 years, all kinds of other things are going to happen that will affect ridership in all kinds of other ways. We do not have the ability to sort all of those things out. And so my statement was not something that you could ever verify. Nevertheless, it served the social function necessary. I had performed a certain kind of expertise in a way that made this person comfortable. But ultimately, it's not what I want to be doing because it's not real. Access is real. How we've expanded your freedom is real. So the more I think about access, it really takes me back to the kinds of debates that really consumed my career in the 90s and aughts and into the teens. Debates about what kind of public transit technology we should build, debates about buses versus light rail versus streetcars versus monorails. Because for most of my career, this has been the transit question. And for most of my career, this is what journalists have come to talk to me about, they've wanted me to express opinions about various transit technologies. And access just does not care about this. And access analysis gives us a new frame for defiantly and proudly not caring about this as much, because access cares about the network. Your access is the result of the pattern of the network, which includes things like its speed and reliability and capacity, which may be affected by the technology. But it resolutely does not care about your emotions about particular technologies, which are so much of what actually has gone into transit planning decisions. And it invites us to ask these questions about the dogma that was fairly absolute, probably 10 to 20 years ago, through the middle part of my career, when a great many leading urbanists were saying that we have, in order for transit to be relevant to urban form, in order for transit to be relevant to development, it has to be on rails because rails are permanent. And developers look at a bus stop, a bus line, and they think, oh, that could change. It could do something, you know, that's not something I can count on. And it's interesting to look back on that argument, which was so convincing to so many people, and understand how completely self-contradictory it was. Since, of course, another part of that rail revival movement was that we should feel was that we should have a sentimental relationship to this martyred technology of the early 20th century streetcar that we used to have and that was destroyed by supposedly by evil forces. But the sheer fact that the early 20th century streetcars are gone is proof enough that rail transit isn't really permanent and that building rails on the street doesn't generate permanence. And the problem with that whole argument was that it was coming understandably from people whose experience is in infrastructure and whose training is thinking about infrastructure. Architects who think about buildings, transportation planners who are used to building roads. And if you're in the business of building things, you have to, and you come to transit with that, you have to make the mental adjustment of remembering that in transit, it is the operating budget that matters ultimately more than the infrastructure cost. The true test of permanence of a transit service is the permanence of its operations. And that requires permanent political support because today when all transit is subsidized, you have to win a battle year after year after year for the operating budget of the transit service. So high ridership service, rail or bus, is permanent, right? The bus on Santa Monica Boulevard is as permanent as any rail service you could imagine because it's a high ridership line, right? Lots of things like that are permanent to that degree because they're successful, and they're successful in ridership terms for reasons you can explain in terms of the pattern of the route in relation to the pattern of the land use pattern. So it is the land use pattern, it is the built environment that is creating that permanence that generates the permanence of the service. It has nothing to do with whether there are rails in the street. Rails are an extremely unreliable symbol of permanence. And I think, in fact, that we're probably going to increasingly see some rail services, not necessarily, I think it's quite possible that not all of the rail services built in the last 20 years are going to be permanent. One has already been shut down. A little piece of the light rail network in San Jose that was built in the 1990s has been turned off permanently because it didn't make any sense and no one was using it. So it raises the question, how can we, as we sort of free ourselves from that history, can we talk more openly about the idea of development responding to transit access, and transit access, the freedom that transit generates, being the thing that the transit-oriented development should orient to? And so this is, this is what we're building in Portland along our inner city streets, 4/1 or 5/1 patterns of residential over retail. It's all tied to the frequent bus network. There's nothing particularly special about the bus service. It's just good frequent bus service that generates a lot of access to opportunity. It's built on a system of frequent network branding that now goes back about 20 years in Portland, and that I spent much of my career going from agency to agency, talking about the importance of identifying your high frequency network, identifying the portion of your network where the next bus is always coming soon. That is now in many ways foundational to land use planning in Portland, as it is in lots of other cities. But ultimately what we're doing when we encourage people to locate on the frequent network and encourage higher density right along the frequent network is we're improving the fit between the land use pattern and the transit system. And we are in particular putting more people in positions where transit will give them more freedom, which is what we're ultimately trying to do. So two other battles that I've engaged much more directly in this edition of the book. One is the problem of the choice rider. You may have heard this distinction, and many people speaking from great authority have used these terms, that the transit riders can be divided into two categories. There is someone called a choice rider who has a car and who likes their car and whom we have to make leave their car in the driveway. And then there is someone called a dependent or captive rider who we presume does not have the option of driving for whatever reason, and therefore has to use transit no matter how bad it is. This distinction actually goes back to primitive transportation models that lacked, well, at the time, simply lacked the processing power to deal with any kind of subtlety. But it turned into a mental crutch that affected a lot of transit planning, because lots of people, when they heard this, particularly lots of relatively influential people, when they heard this, heard the idea that the dependent rider is stuck with us. They're going to ride anyway. So our only way to grow is to attract the choice rider. In other words, we should retool everything we do to the tastes of a relatively elite writer, rather like, for example, the person who's making this comment usually. This became a very effective way, sort of pseudoscientific way, for elites to argue that transit should be organized around their personal tastes. And it led to a lot, it's led to a lot of bad decisions. So here's how it really works. How it really works is that almost everybody is on a spectrum in between these extremes. Not that many people are at either extreme. And one of the things that was observed in this region, in the Los Angeles area in the late 20-teens, was a decline in ridership among people who would have been categorized as dependent or captive. In other words, you can lose them. What was happening in the late 20-teens was a lot, and I know several people here have, Michael Mandel in particular was doing a lot of research on this, that a lot of people bought cars. It was a time when it was relatively cheap to buy cars. It was relatively easy to buy a car. Lots of people bought cars. So that dependent person, that person that you're thinking of as dependent, will buy a car if you force them to, or will figure out some other way to make their trip if you force them to. So very few people are dependent in the sense of continuing to use transit no matter how bad it gets. Another way to think about that is that everybody has only 24 hours in the day. We can't expect people to spend more time than they have on a transit trip just because the transit isn't useful to them. So what this means fundamentally is that we need to plan for the middle 80 to 90%, and we need to spend less time listening to people coming from an extremely elite perspective, people like Elon Musk, for example, who will start with his own personal commute, right, as the basis for designing a supposed solution. That's the tell right there, right? This is an extremely unusual person talking about his extremely unusual tastes, and who simply has lost track of the fact that by virtue of being a billionaire, that means he is a tiny minority, which means there aren't very many of him, which means it makes no sense to plan around his tastes, right? That's the thing that we gently need to help our elites remember. To be an elite is to be a small minority. So the last thing I want to talk about briefly here, and then I look forward to the discussion and questions, which is always the best part of these things, is the morality of location choice. I've become much angrier about this after another 12 years as a practitioner since I wrote the first version of the book. And so there are some things that are said rather politely in the first edition that are said somewhat less politely in the new edition and somewhat more forcefully. Location choice creates the whole problem that we expect transport systems, including public transit, to solve. As people berate transit authorities for failing to solve the problem, they should remember who chose to make that problem easier or harder by choosing where some important destination would be and how it would be laid out. So the geometric layout of a community overwhelmingly determines whether public transit can succeed there, what public transit can actually achieve there. I believe that this can be summarized as 4 fundamental variables, all of which we can explain in geometric terms: density, walkability, linearity, and compactness. Some of you may be familiar with a different taxonomy that was developed by Robert Cervero years ago, of series of things that all begin with D. And I talk in the book about why I prefer my taxonomy to his. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I didn't want to be constrained by terms starting with a single letter. I wanted to get the most precise terms I could come up with. And I wanted also to be more precise about the fact that I'm not talking about culture. I'm not talking about aesthetics. I'm talking about geometry. And I have found that I need to say that as a practitioner, because of course, when we're in the middle of a debate about a public transit plan in a particular community, I'm telling people that their neighborhood is bad or good, right? And it sounds like I'm saying that they as people are bad or good. And so I have to say, no, it's not about you as people. It's not about who you are, but it is about where you are, and it is about the geometric facts of where you are. So these 4 features: density, walkability, linearity, and compactness. And I just want to observe, the worst thing we can build now is not low density. The worst thing we can build now is density without these other three things. Because density needs transit, but density without these other three things can't be served efficiently by transit. So I just want to step through these quickly because it's so fundamental. So density, it's a purely geometric point about density. None of the cultural associations of density matter in the least. These two bus routes both have two buses on them, which means they cost the same to operate. But the one in the upper image just has twice as many people in the walking distance around every stop. So of course, there's twice the ridership, even before you start asking whether the people in the higher density community are individually more likely to use transit, which they also are, which is why the relationship between density and ridership is actually a little bit nonlinear, curving upward. Walkability. That's on the left side of this image, the dot in the center is a bus stop and the circle is the abstract quarter-mile radius around the bus stop. And in the old days, before we had good models for these things, we just drew circles around stations and said that's the catchment area. In fact, there's a street network inside that circle. And what is shown here is highlighted in black, the portions of that circle where you can actually walk to the stop in a quarter mile. And obviously, a highly connected street grid gives you more than 2/3 of the circle actually within a quarter mile walk. A highly disconnected street grid simply walls off large parts of the circle so that they can't get to the stop. For me as a transit planner, that's exactly as if the density were lower, right? There's just less there to achieve with that stop. The other important thing, of course, is that it must be possible to cross the street at the stop. And this is an enormous issue when we're talking with Caltrans, for example, when we're talking with our state highway authorities, who are many of whom have rules like you shouldn't have a signal more than every half mile because it mucks up the traffic flow, right, to have too many signals. From a transit perspective, I want a signal every quarter mile because that's the ideal spacing for bus stops, and it needs to be safe to cross the street at every bus stop. When we put two stops on opposite sides of a street where it is not safe to cross, we're providing one-way service. Now, we actually know people run across the street in these places, and you'll see that happen, and they get killed. And all that's bad. All that is why walkability is so fundamental. Compactness, of course, does transit have to cross long, low ridership gaps? Do we have to cross Beverly Hills to get to West Hollywood, right? Do we have to go through bits of what's basically empty space in order to connect major destinations? That makes things a little weaker. But this is the really important one. This is the one where the worst mistakes are being made. Linearity. So these two little abstract towns here are made up of the same four destinations, right? So there's an office complex on the left, and then there's Walmart behind a quarter mile of parking, and there's a little college, and then there's a residential area. And it makes all the difference in the world whether those things are oriented toward a continuous path where I can provide a service that feels like a direct service between any two of them, or whether they're all set back from the path. Set back from the path so that the office towers are on a cul-de-sac by the freeway, designed to look good from the freeway. Walmart behind a quarter mile of parking. The college up on a hilltop, Occidental, right? Up on a hilltop at the end of a little road, not on the way to anywhere. That kind of development pattern is just inimical to transit because I can't hook multiple points together, which is what makes a strong line. Everything needs its own line, or else I have a line like this that has to deviate. And as you can see, the lower line in this image is just longer, which means it's more expensive to provide, and it takes people on a slower path that gives them less freedom. So the thing about linearity is that while everyone in the architecture and urbanism community understands density, walkability, and compactness, linearity is a thing that's just about transit. And it's a thing that we particularly run into as transit planners and have to go on about. So, campuses, what does a typical community college campus in America look like? It looks like, here's the main street, and here's the main street, and there is the center of the campus located such that the main destinations are absolutely as far from the street as they could be placed, so that the bus either has to stop out here and people have to walk through all the parking, or the bus has to drive in here, spending lots of time doing something nonlinear. That is the standard community college campus. Community college campus is particularly geared toward lower income people who are especially likely to be transit dependent. And over all over the country, we've built them like this. Dense housing. Housing above a certain density is going to generate a degree of transit demand, and all over the place. We get into the suburbs and we find high density housing. This particular case, this is in Riverdale, Georgia. What I've got here is a nice east-west road that I would like to be able to run transit on. It's got some medical facilities here. It's got all these apartments, but right down there, it runs into a giant state highway with a right in, right out intersection. Right in, right out, of course, it means I can't turn left out of it. I can only turn right out of it or right into it. There's no way you can run public transit on it. Right? There's no way to draw a logical route those are the only movements you can make. So it's impossible to serve these people. So what does that mean? High density where everyone is forced to drive. That is the recipe for traffic congestion, right? A large amount of trip generation in a small area because we're forcing everyone to use cars because of the way this has been built. Social services. This, I think, is probably the thing that has continued to make me angriest because I see it everywhere. I see it in very progressive places, like, say, Salinas, California. Salinas on the Central Coast is a very low-income city. Average household income is below $30,000 a year, overwhelmingly Spanish-speaking. And look where their social services are. So here's downtown Salinas in the upper left of the drawing. There's the Social Security office. There's the county government center where you have to get all kinds of, we have to go for various kinds of business with the county. It's on a cul-de-sac next to the freeway. Then across the freeway, there's the County Department of Child Support there, the CalWorks Employment Services there, out in an industrial park behind the freeway. So this Route 96, when we did the redesign for Monterey Salinas Transit, we had to draw this Route 96, but it does nothing except go to those maroon destinations. There's nothing else for it to serve. This is low density industrial territory. So it only comes once an hour because that's all we could afford for a route that had such a small market. And so people have to spend a large part of their day to go out there to get to one of these places. And then over here, the primary community college in the area built a new campus. Right over there, they decided that would be a good spot. All right, well, the major transit corridor has for decades gone like this. Are we supposed to drag it down there just because they built that there? Or are those people, are the kids going to have to walk up to a half mile up to Williams to get a bus? Well, we ended up deciding they're going to have to walk. A lot of them will drive. This is these kinds of location choices are just profoundly, profoundly destructive for all the kinds of outcomes that we want in from public transit. So I wanted to end with that because I just want to leave you with a sense of just how much relatively low-hanging fruit there is really in improving the kinds of landscapes that we have to deal with. I hope this is something in particular that will now bother you as much as it has always bothered me. So thanks very much, and look forward to your questions and thoughts.
So thank you so much for this presentation. I feel like it captured, I don't know, 2 years of urban planning school in half an hour. I want to zoom out for a second just to open with, what are the stakes of all this? In the introduction, I think this is new in the new edition, you write about cars creating an ambient massacre of the innocence that we are expected to treat as normal. I think it's powerful language, and there's pollution and emissions and all sorts of other problems. What are the stakes of getting this right, and what are the stakes of getting this wrong?
Yeah, the stakes of getting this wrong are what we're living.
For the Zoom. Yeah.
Does this work? So the stakes, the stakes of continuing to force people to drive and to force people to depend on cars more than they want to is, I think, all the things that we see around us, and that you certainly see around you in life in Southern California. It's very easy to look at Los Angeles and immediately visualize just how much nicer it could be, how much healthier it could be. It could be such a great place to live. It's such a great climate. There's so many things going for it, but um, cars dominate everything, and cars take away most of the space in which you could have a great city, and they are also killing us. And so, so that's what's at stake. And it's not just climate, it's not just equity, it's also, you know, it's also just the extraordinary levels of danger that cars represent.
So, you talk about this a bit in the updated edition, but what did COVID change about this? We're now 4 years into this.
Um, COVID liberated the transit industry to focus much more on where it can really succeed. So what COVID did was to take a lot of the pressure from the elite, from the people who think of themselves as choice riders, the elite commuter who wants a really nice experience. They all went away. They're all working at home now. So who's left on the public transit system is everyone else, and everyone else is so much easier to serve because they are going back and forth all day. They are not creating huge jams at one time of day, except to some extent around school bell times. But and they're generating demand that's two-way all day, 7 days a week, much more cost effective for transit to serve. So don't be worried about the high level statistic you hear about overall transit ridership still being down from before COVID. We're not going back to that world. And a lot of that ridership was incredibly expensive to serve. It needed a one-way bus or train from, Agora Hills, Woodland Hills, wherever, into downtown Los Angeles, a distance of 20 or 30 miles. And a driver was going to pull out this bus or train, drive in once, maybe with a bus or train with a lot of people, and then go all the way back empty, and that would be their entire morning shift, right? Fantastically inefficient use of labor. And so peaking is that peaking is so expensive for three reasons. It's the short shift. You've got to pay drivers for more than 2 hours to work for 2 hours. It's the one-way nature of the demand. Remember, driver shifts have to end where they began. They've got to take the bus back after they've taken it in full. And it's the need to own a lot of fleet that isn't being used very efficiently. So all over the U.S. now, one of the things that's really great for transit agencies is the transit fleets are shrinking because the remaining fleet is being used so much more efficiently because it's being used increasingly all day two-way. And the LA Metro Next Gen project, which I wasn't involved in, grabbed onto that and was able to do a lot of very impressive all-day frequency increases of the kind that are useful to all kinds of people for all kinds of purposes. And that's where transit's growing. Many transit agencies are now above their pre-COVID ridership on Saturday and Sunday. And they're not going to get there on weekday because weekday was always distorted by that peak. But I think the future is great for in this kind of new world where the very elite commuter has become a smaller part of our concern, and we are more free to focus on people who are frankly much easier to attract to transit, which is everyone else.
So I wanted to follow up on that point about ridership. In 2020, 2021, you wrote a piece in Bloomberg sort of arguing that ridership isn't the core metric we should be focused on. In 2018, 19, 20, we did a number of studies here looking at falling pre-pandemic ridership, the implications for transit agencies, the access benefits to people who got cars and that stuff. So we'd like to still think that ridership is an important metric. When can we start caring about it again? I guess is the question.
I think you can care about it. You need to do a little bit of education about why we're caring about it and also why we're caring about a lot of other things. So there is this thing that I explain in the book called the ridership coverage trade-off, which is that if you actually managed a transit system exclusively for the goal of ridership. What you would do is concentrate only on the highest density corridors, and large parts of the city that are not as conducive to public transit just would not be served at all. So, and one of the things we do in our work, in our studies, is we take transit agencies through this thought process. We take their boards, their decision makers through this thought process. How much do you actually want ridership? How much do you want to set aside to maintain some level of coverage for areas that are never going to generate high ridership because they are not dense, walkable, or linear, right? And we have to figure that out, because the fact is, every community has lots of people who support public transit because it is doing something other than ridership. Because it is, for example, providing lifeline access to people who are not going to have any transit if you design the network for ridership, because they just don't live in a place where high ridership transit would go. So transit agencies have to think, okay, so there's this thing transit agencies are doing that is not about ridership, and that there is a set of routes inside of every network that should not be evaluated on their ridership, because ridership isn't their purpose. That includes microtransit, and it includes a whole lot of low productivity fixed routes. Ridership is just not the point. If ridership were what you were optimizing for, they just wouldn't exist. So that's part of it. I think the other part of it, though, is that although access captures how network design affects ridership, I'd like to talk to people to be talking more about access as its own kind of good, that it is good that people have these freedoms independent of what they actually do with them. And that's it only is a freedom if it exists independent of what you do with it. Otherwise, you're just another predicted, someone doing something the model predicted inside of an imagined and managed society. So I think it's important to talk about that, because ridership is going to go up and down for all kinds of external reasons that aren't, and so we have to have a story about the enduring value of transit, so that the value of transit doesn't seem to be going up and down as ridership is going up and down, because it isn't. There is a permanent value in the access to opportunity that a service provides, even as ridership goes up and down. And ridership is just not measuring that value. So I think I think those are some of the reasons why we have to be careful about how we talk about ridership. And certainly when journalists come to me and they start asking me questions about, what's it going to take to get the ridership back, I have to start by taking them back through all that and making sure that they understand that ridership isn't the only thing transit is doing, and transit would be doing completely different things if it were.
So you mentioned microtransit. LA Metro is exploring or has deployed Metro Micro here in Westwood, other places. How do you design microtransit well? Where can it work and where shouldn't it be deployed?
I try to, when I'm confronted with a question, here is this tool, how should we use it? I want to reframe the question. I want to go back to the goal. What are you trying to do? Is this a useful tool? Now, that is the natural tension that you experience every time you go into the hardware store. Because you go into the hardware store with your goal in mind, right? You're going to fix up this project here. You need these tools for it. But in the hardware store, there's a display. Isn't it time to redo your kitchen? We have everything you need right here. Okay, so the hardware store, they sell tools. They want you to fixate on tools. They want your goal to be whatever uses that tool. That's what advertising is. So when you ask me, how do we use microtransit? I have to say, you're talking in the language of the advertiser of the product. And that's not an empowering position for you to be in as a customer of the product. As a customer of the product, you ought to have your own notion of the project you want to do before you go into the hardware store, so that you don't just come out doing whatever project the hardware store is selling that week. That is, I guess, my main reaction to that. So what is microtransit? Microtransit is a very old idea, which is a demand responsive service. It's a small van that is confined to a certain area that it'll operate in. It will come out to a transfer point and connect you with the rest of the network. And then inside this zone, it will take you more or less wherever you want to go on demand. You can request it. In the old days, you called up by phone the day before and requested it. Now it's more efficient. You can request it on an app on shorter notice. And what the van does as it cycles through the area depends on who calls it. Fine. A whole lot of technology has come along and made old-fashioned dial-a-ride more efficient. But it has also come with, I think, a very confusing marketing campaign to convey that something entirely new has been invented, and I don't think it has. I think we've taken dial-a-ride and made it more efficient. But it's still what it is. It is still a vehicle going over here to get this person, and then going over there to get that person, and then going over to there to get that person. It is by its nature meandering. It is not taking you on a straight path to your destination. And it is by its nature a very inefficient use of labor. The way fixed routes work, by contrast, is that you walk out to them, and it is because you walk out to them that once you're on the bus goes straight and gathers lots of people because they gathered themselves in a straight line. That's what you do when you walk to the bus stop. People are organizing themselves into a straight line that the bus will be able to serve efficiently, and that's why fixed routes routinely do, 10 times the productivity of demand responsive services like microtransit. So nothing against it. We use demand responsive service in our plans all the time. It's on the coverage side of the ledger, right? We're very clear. These are always coverage services. The other thing we do with microtransit, which is contrary to how some of its promoters market it, we don't want this to turn into a taxi cab. We don't want this to to pull up into your driveway and sit there while you put on your coat. Because what we're trying to do with microtransit is more efficient coverage. Now, this is very important. The goal here is coverage. It's not ridership. I don't actually care about the ridership of the microtransit. In fact, too much ridership is the death of microtransit. Microtransit will fall over if it has too many riders. So what I want is to get credit for having covered this large, low-density area that's not suitable for fixed routes. I want to be able to say that everyone in this area has access to transit within a quarter mile. So to do that, what I design is a demand responsive service that will go within a quarter mile of everyone's house, which does not mean to their door. It means maybe they'll have to walk down to the end of their cul-de-sac. The van is not going to get stuck in your cul-de-sac. It's not going to get into in rural areas especially, you get into all sorts of horrible dirt roads that you just don't want to be driving in, and you don't have to. If you keep to that quarter mile rule, walk out to where we can meet you. And so that helps the microtransit vehicle operate in a somewhat less circuitous path, which allows it to serve some more people. But more importantly, it allows us to spend the minimum necessary to provide the lifeline access that is the point of what we're doing, the coverage of the area. So anyway, I have strong feelings about that because I've just heard so much nonsense about it over the last few years, and I hope that we're getting past the peak of the hype cycle and able to actually use it as a tool.
So you talked about sort of factors within the control of transit decision makers and those without, and obviously transit decision makers aren't going to be able to control the next pandemic until at least we get the microchips in order. But some of the decision makers you're talking to, depending on the governance structure, can control things like, and we have world experts in this room, the management and pricing of parking and driving. So where do you see sort of the impact of managing other modes, particularly driving, on transit and the goals that you talk about?
Oh, it's fundamental. And the question is always the sort of chicken egg question of how good does transit have to be before you start making driving more difficult. And, it's interesting watching the debate going on around decongestion pricing in Manhattan. I think that this is but ultimately, we're going to have to take more space on streets for public transit. Measure at HLA was an extraordinary achievement in this region and was a great encouragement to people all over the country and to some extent all over the world that, we could get that sort of clear statement from the voters that actually, yes, when we went to those meetings and did all those plans about bus lanes, we actually meant that. We meant you were actually going to build those. and and so I think LA is going to start to become really inspiring to a lot of other places that have to deal with these issues. I think the other thing that's important is that when we're talking about bus lanes, we need to not get too caught up in the formalities of bus rapid transit as infrastructure. In San Francisco, they use the number 49 a lot, and the 49ers and all that. And one of the nice bits of San Francisco trivia is that the transit first policy, which theoretically said that cars should not be getting in the way of transit, was passed in 1973. And the Van Ness busway was finally, outside of City Hall, was finally opened in 2022. That's 49 years. Before the policy was finally implemented. And that had to do with a large extent with just a whole lot of complexity that comes and cost that comes when you design something as a huge piece of infrastructure. I think what we know in Los Angeles and what San Francisco knows too, from what it's done on many other cities, is that bus lanes are mostly paint and signs and enforcement, and it does not have to be a giant infrastructure project. It can be, and I mean, Venice is great because it's a median BRT lane. Now it's not going to trip over traffic, but there's a whole lot you can accomplish short of that without letting it be the kind of giant project that takes decades to implement.
So I want to ask one more question here and then turn it over to you all. This is, again, to take a step back, look at this book, the revised edition. In the room, we have current and future decision makers and planners and researchers. What tips would you give for writing well in a planning and transportation audience to communicating well? Because I think this book cuts through a lot of the jargon that so often, we tend to do in academia.
If you are being rewarded right now for writing in a particular style, if you are writing right now to a particular professor who wants to see a particular kind of style, or if you're writing to fit into a particular kind of discourse where you feel like you have to use certain words in order to sound like you belong in that conversation, learn how to do that if you must, but be aware that you're doing it and don't just let it become a habit to do it. Because what you have to do in this profession is be thinking very carefully about your audience when you're writing. And unfortunately, and I don't mean to express an opinion about how writing is taught here or how writing is rewarded here, but in general, there are many academic fields in which the path to success is not great writing that connects with large numbers of people. The path to success is a more jargon-laden kind of writing that sounds more precise and sometimes is more precise. Sometimes you do need a special word to say something precise, but that can also then be the wrong way to talk to a larger audience. Let me give you a really simple example outside the space of transportation because it's really obvious. I'm a botany geek. That means, among many other things rattling around in my head are several thousand scientific names of plants. There are certain contexts in which I will refer to a plant by its scientific name. But I'm not going to do that in a conversation with an ordinary person. If I'm talking about a Douglas fir, I'm not going to say Pseudotsuga menziesii until I know I'm talking to another botanist. So it's just that sort of instinct. You have to remain aware that your jargon is jargon in the way that, botanists are aware that you don't just deploy scientific names when you first start talking to someone. You just got to be aware of that and be aware then of how not to do that when you're talking to someone else. When our people at my firm are sitting down and starting to write reports, I will keep giving them the instruction, write a letter to your grandmother explaining this. Write a letter to someone you know outside your profession who does not know any of your jargon explaining this. Think about that person, talk to them. That often helps.
Thanks. So with that, Phoebe, do you have a mic? Just raise your hand if you have a question, and Phoebe will come around to you.
Uh, in your book, and then even today, you're talking about the problem of labor as a large cost of providing transit, especially in those peak hours. Do you or do you have someone that you look to as someone who's done a good job about combating that issue?
I think I need clarification. What is the issue exactly as you're thinking about it in terms of combating?
Right. Immediately defining the goal about trying to um, provide the service, thinking about transit as a service,
Mhm.
and with many competing needs.
Right.
One of those competing needs being unionized labor or paying people well,
Mhm.
but doing so might reduce the amount of frequency of the service. I guess it's a plumber's problem, but um, have you do you have a personal take on the best way to deal with that?
Um, I generally believe that public transit drivers, and especially bus drivers, do an extremely difficult job. If you've ever watched what they do, next time you're on the bus, just watch, sit near them and just watch what they deal with. And the whole lot of things that they're dealing with that you're not even aware of, like their schedule and how they're managing their schedule as they go. I would like to. I'm also, of course, someone who uses transit when he can, but of necessity uses Lyft a fair bit when he can. I'm extremely clear on the difference between what union wages buy in transit drivers and what you can expect of a Lyft driver. It's night and day. So I'm not too worried about, I get into quarrels with unions when they start trying to dictate details of transit plans that don't have much to do with labor conditions. But I'm very pro-labor, and I don't feel like I don't feel like the American transit workforce is particularly coddled in any way. I think they were underpaid. We're having to pay them more now in order to keep them. But we need, and one of the challenges really too is that we need, especially in the bus system, we need transit drivers who are personable, who like people. And the introverts have all gone to drive for Amazon, where they never have to deal with people. But there are people out there who actually like other people, and those are the ones who should be bus drivers. But that's a rare skill. That's special. You've got to pay for that. You can't expect anybody at minimum wage to be able to do that.
Hey, Juan Matute, Deputy Director of the Institute of Transportation Studies here at UCLA. Transacting with transit and understanding how to use transit is something that we've made very difficult, I think, for folks, especially for somebody who has not used a system before. And so every system has some different idiosyncrasy. I'm wondering if you've seen some opportunities to make it so that it is a more easy to understand and natural type of transaction for somebody who's first trying transit or a new system.
Boy, that's a big, complicated question. There's so many different points of entry into transit. And I know for many of you now, the assumption is that the point of entry to everything is your phone and is some sort of app that will give you the information you need. And that's helped enormously. Maybe just by virtue of being at the very, very tail end of the boomers, I have a somewhat pre-digital sense of this. So let me mention just a really simple example. I've been staying near Pershing Square for the last week as I've been doing various courses it was sort of the logical place to be so I could get to all these places on transit. And so I've been in downtown and I've been watching all these orange buses pouring through past me. And if I was in Portland or in San Francisco, a glance at those buses would tell me what they do. Because the overhead sign on a bus in San Francisco says Geary to 48th Avenue. And if you know San Francisco, that's the route. It's a very, very effective advertisement for the route. And what I see here is a sign that says something like 720 Santa Monica, go Lakers. And that's what it says. It should say 720 Wilshire Rapid to Santa Monica. That would be a complete description of the route. Instead, I have no way of knowing that what matters to me downtown is which of these is Wilshire, which is Venice, which is Melrose. It's not telling me any of that. It's giving me useless information about outer endpoints, even though the 720 is not the thing I would take from downtown if I were going to Santa Monica. It is just the thing that is saying what direction it's going. So though that electric signage, which is so prominent and which so many people notice, in San Francisco and in Portland in particular, we use to tell a story about what this bus does because we want people to see that. We want that transparency to be visible. And many others don't. I was just at a conference earlier this week with a number of European guests. And I asked one of them, would any European transit agency ever use that electric sign to say something like "Go Lakers"? No. No, they have, by the way, a much, much harder navigation problem in Europe. Los Angeles is just like Chicago, is just a spectacularly legible city. It's spectacularly simple, this big grid of long streets, where if you just say Melrose to West Hollywood, you've defined something that thousands and thousands of people will find useful. You know, in Europe, the street names are constantly changing. It's all much more difficult. Their navigation problem is much harder, but still they do everything they can with it because they understand they need that transparency. They need you to see out of the corner of your eye something that might be useful, which is what I'm always looking for. I've been thinking a lot about Go Lakers because it's something that it's a distinctly American use of signage. It's not something you'll see in Europe. It's not something you'll see in Asia. And I think I think it goes back to a belief that the transit rider is not the real audience that matters, and that we need to instead care about these other people who are out there in cars and what they think of us. And that, I don't think that's the path to success. Okay.
I was struck by your illustration of the community college set back. And are you aware of examples where transit agencies have lobbied for better sighting? I guess you mentioned the situation in Salinas. Or do you have at least any strategies or rhetorical to get the transit agencies to influence the land use in institutions like that?
This is very important. You can't expect the transit agencies to do this. The transit agencies operate at a time scale that is just too short term. And even the most sophisticated transit agencies like LA Metro, they're going to do what they can, but this is something that the architecture and urban planning world has to be educated about as something they should care about. If you will follow me, oops, it's gone. My handle on Twitter is Human Transit. You can also find the blog humantransit.org. Our firm just finished writing a guide to planning for buses, written to city planners, town planners. It was written for the National Transport Authority of Ireland, so it is all about Ireland. And so a whole lot of details will seem strange, but it is the sort of document that is needed. This cannot happen through transit agency comments on a plan. By the time a campus plan has gotten to the point where you're collecting those kinds of comments, they've already made those big mistakes. Often the mistake is where to put it to begin with, right? And so that's why the emphasis I put in the book is on the need for all of us to have the tools to hold responsible the people who made those decisions. Let me give you an egregious example. I'm working for a city somewhere in the middle of the country where way out in the next county, barely reachable by the transit system, is a hospital. And in the way the whole hospital network works, low-income people who go to a local clinic near their home, which they can get to, have to go way out to the next county to see a specialist because the specialists are all out there. Why are the specialists all out there? Because it's convenient to their horse farms, right? They don't have to come into the city and deal with people. And so that's what we've evolved, you know. The employer that moves from downtown out to a cul-de-sac in a business park because it's closer to the CEO's horse farm, that's often why they do it. And then, of course, they call up the transit agency. What happened to our transit service? They say. This actually happens. Companies actually do this. That's how stupid this decision-making is. Or not stupid, it's how ignorant the decision-making is. And so I think that I think you cannot expect the transit agency to be the lead on that. It's really an educational task in the city planning world that is really not being done or has not been done.
I can ask another question here. What is the role, I guess, of outside consultants in this? Because I think sometimes you need an outside pair of eyes, but especially on the capital side, we've have a lot of research that outside consulting drives up costs and make things more complicated. So justify yourself.
Yes, there are consultants who give consultants a bad name. Here is there are a bunch of things consultants get used for, which I don't think are a very good use of consultants. In organizations, in government organizations that are extremely limited in who they can hire, and under enormous pressure to not hire people, you end up using consultants as extensions of staff because you have more work to do than you can do with the staff you have. And you really should solve that problem by hiring people and building up that capability in your organization. A lot of consultants do a lot of work that is really just that. Consultants often also get hired for deniability. Consultants get hired so that you will have an organization will have someone external that they can blame or hold responsible. That's also not a very good reason, but it's a common reason. Here's what I'm useful for as a consultant and what my firm is useful for. We're good at a particular thing. We're really good at figuring out the layout of bus networks, and we're really good at helping communities think through that with us. When I come into a community as a consultant, I'm really, really clear. I'm sitting with people there and I'm saying, now it is not my job to know your community as well as you do. I never will. You're always going to know your community better than I do. I am here to bring a particular kind of experience as somebody who does this in 7 or 8, 10 cities every year. I have a certain knack for doing this a particular way that seems to work, but I still have to do it with you because this ultimately has to be something that you're going to own. And if you end up at the end of this process standing up in front of your board and saying, this is the consultant's recommendation, I will know I have failed because that is not what I am trying to do. I do not want this to be mine. I want it to be yours. So I'm pretty adamant about that. And that is, and I am not always hired. You know, it's a competitive business. I'm sometimes not hired because sometimes clients don't want me. Sometimes clients hear my spiel and realize I'm going to make them work harder, do more work than they want to do. And I'm not going to just take this problem off their hands and take responsibility for it, which is what some clients want, but you just can't do it that way. Because if you end up with the consultant's recommendation and the staff is all standing up in front of the board saying, ooh, this smart consultant told us we should do this, it's perfectly easy to either, it's not going to come out well. It's not going to come out well. You have to have the ownership. So that's what consultants are for.
Besides 2-hour light rail commutes, what do you think LA's future solution will be to getting people into downtown LA? And I guess like I'm curious what your thoughts are on what they're doing right now in terms of their station area designs, having these little pockets of high density TOD next to Del Tacos and other gas stations and stuff like that. Where do you see the future of LA Metro in moving people throughout the city, I guess?
Well, it's interesting that you talk about getting people into downtown. Downtown's awfully far away. I came here from downtown this morning on transit. It took me an hour and a half. It was perfectly pleasant. I took the subway to from Pershing Square to Hollywood Island, and then I took the 2 bus from there across West Hollywood and Beverly Hills. And you look at something, but Los Angeles is, in its larger being, a constellation of lots of different centers. And I have never been particularly sold on the idea that downtown Los Angeles is the place everyone should have to go. I think that's a very early 20th century model of a city. And I think Los Angeles is actually the model of something better than that. I think Los Angeles is a model of a constellation structured, multi-centered city, where polycentric does not mean sprawl. Polycentric means lots of downtowns, lots of centers, lots of places that can be focal points. And so the beautiful thing about the subway that is being built out in this direction right now, they just actually finished boring through it. When that subway opens, what's so great about the Wilshire corridor is the bidirectionality of its demand, that so many people are commuting into Westwood at the same time that so many other people are commuting toward downtown. And I constantly talk about that bidirectionality. It's something, this is by contrast, an enormous weakness of Chicago, which is the sort of the kind of doppelganger. Chicago, which has this overwhelmingly single center, and really not much else in the way of focal points inside the city. Chicago, just enormously inefficient one-way flows into this single giant center. What you've got is so much better than that here. You've got so much more to work with in the multi-destinational kind of structure of Los Angeles. So I hope that in 10 or 20 years, overall, more and more people that you will have cracked the larger housing problem, and that more and more people are living in a place that's geographically works for them, and that not that many people are commuting the enormous distances. I think that is already always how Los Angeles has worked. I used to work a lot. I mean, I went to college in Claremont, of course, and I used to work a lot for the agencies that are way out inland. The city goes continuously for 100 miles. There's 100 miles of continuous city going east of here, but nobody commutes 100 miles. These people are commuting 20 miles to there, and these people are commuting to there, and these people commute to there. It's a lot of overlapping small commutes. It's a lot of overlapping small markets. It's a giant constellation. I think that can be a good structure. I think that can work well. It does require, of course, more density around stations. It does require appropriate densification. I know there's a sort of lot by lot battle, and I don't worry too much, to go to the other part of your question about what's in the initial plans, because I know this will get revisited over and over again. I think that the revolution we're seeing in how we think about zoning and how we think about housing is leading really exciting places, largely because of a lot of leadership from what is mostly your generation. I'm immensely excited about what I'm seeing in the whole housing and zoning situation, because so many of the horrors that I've had to deal with as a transit planner and that I describe in the book were designed, are in the zoning, that it has to be bad in those ways. And it doesn't have to be that way.
By the way, Josh Stevens, California Planning and Development Report. Do you have strong feelings about how autonomous vehicles will affect transit? Is that just another sort of exogenous influence on that overall ridership pattern, or is there something special that transit agencies should be thinking about?
Well, again, you can't just put this on the transit agencies. Everyone needs to be thinking about these things. The danger of the autonomous private car developing in the absence of autonomous big vehicle transit is that if, God forbid, autonomous technology were to become so reliable and so scalable that it actually became cheap to have an autonomous car while human beings were still driving the buses, that would be a recipe for a vast shift of passengers from large vehicles into small ones, which is an increase in VMT. And nothing you can do with vehicle electrification is going to compensate for there being so many more vehicles, and again, you're going to have the purely geometric problem of congestion, which is not affected by any of those things. So I think that's a nightmare scenario. Now, in a scenario where, so I think the only solution to that, as that problem appears, is appropriate kinds of pricing that push back the other way. It is also conceivable that someday we could have autonomous buses. Remembering that the driver's time is the primary cost of operating a transit service. And so if you truly did not need an employee on every vehicle, you could have dramatically more abundant service. Now, of course, we have this in rail rapid transit, started in Vancouver in 1986. Vancouver's been running this system for years now. You get on the Vancouver SkyTrain system at midnight on a Tuesday, the trains are still coming every 3 minutes, because why not? They've broken the connection between frequency and cost. But and so yes, a fully autonomous bus, which I can imagine, I can visualize, and partly because I've spent enough time on SkyTrain, I'm over the whole notion of, oh, but what would happen in an emergency? Well, the fact is, in an emergency, the people at the control center actually often have a better picture of what's happening than the person in the cab. Can often deploy more resources. So I don't know what will happen, but it is really important to be clear that transit is doing what it's doing in terms of the efficiency with which it uses space, because of the size of the vehicle, and anything that makes separate smaller vehicles more attractive is a negative for VMT and for all those other outcomes.
Hi. Well, looking at what you said, obviously, it seems like a lot of work that's being done now, obviously, is like very incremental approaches, right? We're trying to improve service by 5%, 10%. But obviously, with the state of transit in the US, we could double transit ridership and it would still be relatively low. Like we're talking about 10 to 20% in most cities, ideally with the doubling. So like what kinds of approaches in terms of like incrementalism do you think are most important for us to get to that point where we can really make a big push? Because obviously currently the funding picture, the political picture is not quite there yet, but like say like in a decade down the road, what would we want to have already implemented for us to be able to make that next big step?
I think that the Measure HLA bus lanes are going to make a big difference. I think that especially if if LA Metro's thinking sort of continues to evolve about how they present the bus service, I think there's the potential for that to make an enormous difference. Obviously, speed and reliability problems are also operating cost problems. A slower service takes longer to cycle, costs more to operate. So so there's a lot of potential there. But I'm generally, I guess I'm at an age where I get to say I'm more optimistic than I've ever been now. And I think it's mostly because of the conversations that I'm hearing around me now and how they compare to the conversations I've heard around me for most of my career. I think you have to accept that the built environment and the status quo that you have inherited, that your generation is inheriting, is not, we know it's not what you would design, and that's great. Go change it. Go make it something better. I hope to live to see it, because I'm very, very optimistic about what can be done now. I do think that You know, we have a lot of big challenges ahead, a lot of great difficult debates. You know, we know how the unions feel about autonomous vehicles. We've got all those debates to have. But I also think that we've got some clarity now about what's at stake and some energy behind going the right direction that I really have not encountered, you know, in 50 years of following, of watching these debates in California and Oregon and other places. So.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end it on. So I want to sincerely thank you, Jarrett, for coming here and giving this talk. Two quick notes for everybody. One is, again, if you didn't check in, please check in with the QR code here if you came. And then second, there are copies of the book for sale over here from the UCLA bookstore. So please pick up a copy if you're interested, and Jarrett will stick around for a few minutes.